So let me just say one thing about the voter turnout. I'm a bit irked by a change of terminology, and that's a quirk on my side. The IEC now talks about 12 million odd voters were processed through the voter management devices. I wish they would just stick to one terminology. Say 12 million people voted, or something like that, were processed through the voter management devices. Could mean anything. But anyway, that's just an aside on my part. And I only say it because the issue of voter turnout is really the big story of the moment, and we want to be as accurate as possible. What are we talking about at this point? Hopefully we'll get further details from the IEC later on. Well, let's delve deeper then into the issues around this election. Results are slowly trickling in, and according to the IEC, 90% of counting will be done by tonight. I'm joined now by political analyst Sanet Madonsela from the University of the Free State. Sanet, good afternoon. Thank you for joining me. So I just made that aside comment about, the importance of voter turnout in this election. It's billed to be the lowest turnout since 1994. And you're talking here across, the general elections as well as the local government elections. What went wrong in your view?
Okay, so I think when we look at voter turnout, it's important to take into consideration that South Africa has a population of 60 million people. That's like from July this year. And then of that amount, only 42 million were eligible to vote. And then if you break it down even further, then of the 42 million, only 26 million registered and only 12 million voted, which means that we have a very, very low voter turnout, but also a very low amount of people who are actually participating in the electoral process. Then in terms of what went wrong, there are a number of factors. I've heard people blame it on the weather. I've heard people blame it on the fact that it's on a Monday. But I also think that there are other things that need to be taken into account, such as your high unemployment rate amongst your youth. You have high unemployment rates just generally. You have a lack of service delivery. You have low economic growth, which means that there's even less opportunities. Then you also have a skills gap, which means that even when your graduates do go into the employment sector, they lack the skills that the economy actually needs. So there are a number of factors that need to be taken into consideration when making such a decision about what may or may not have gone wrong.
And what's your sense of this conversation that talks about, who benefits from a low voter turnout? Is it possible to talk about that with any degree of certainty, whether a low voter turnout benefits a governing party wherever, in the country, in the instances where perhaps it's the DA or it's the ANC, or simply not able to make sense of that?
Okay, I think that in terms of just looking at elections as a whole, you need more people to participate in the electoral process in order for you to be an accountable government, in order for you to be recognized as a government. But what happens when you have less and less people participating in the elections, it means that you are less accountable, or that the people don't identify with you. So while pockets of governing parties or parties can benefit from it, I think that it is negative in terms of democracy as a whole. But I do think that if you look at the turnout in terms of your more suburban areas, you find that they may benefit if more suburban people go out. But you also see that in terms of the ANC, a large portion of its voters didn't come out to vote, but they also didn't go and vote for other political parties. So I think that they're basically punishing their party, if I may.
Yeah. In fact, I'd like you to tease out a little bit more there, Sanet, one of the points you made in the last few minutes, where you talk about, quote unquote, you say it's negative for democracy as a whole. In one of the simplifications of what democracy entails is the principle of majority rules. But it would seem, by default, we are going to a situation of minority rules. And I wonder whether, at what point do we get to points about legitimacy of any government elected by 12 million people when could have been elected by, 42 million? or at worst 26 million, that are said to have been registered. Do we get into conversations about legitimacy? I know that it's a bit complex with this particular election because turnout varies from ward to ward, from council to council. But I wonder if this trend is sustained into general elections, for example. Would we get to that conversation?
I do think that when you talk about legitimacy, I think that voter turnout plays a very important part in whether people regard a government as legitimate or whether they don't think of the government as legitimate. In terms of looking at our statistics, if you have a population of over 60 million people and you have 42 million people who are eligible to vote, but more than half of those people don't vote, can you then really say that you are a majority ruling party? Can you then really say that you are legitimate government, because more than half of your population isn't voting and isn't participating in the electoral process? So I do think that it becomes more dangerous if you do look at the overall statistics in terms of the number of people who can participate in elections, the number of people who are participating in elections, and the number of people who are eligible but just choose to not participate in the elections. I think here voter empathy, apathy, and also voter isolation comes into play, because they are determining factors in terms of whether people are going to come out in their numbers or people not going to come out in their numbers.
Lastly, Sanet, let me ask you to then locate that particular aspect within other forms of sometimes democratic expression, sometimes, debatable how democratic it is in terms of the protest culture in this country. Does this then tell us that many more people think there are alternative forms of democratic expression that capture their will better than the vote?
I think it's quite sad, actually, because I think it's important to participate in the electoral process, but I also feel that maybe people don't believe in voting anymore because they participate in the electoral process every 5 years or so, but nothing really changes. If you look at the number of people living in poverty between 94 and even now, you'll see that a lot of people are living in poverty. A lot of people still don't have running water. The number of people who don't have sanitation, basic services has just remained either the same or even increase, and that some people are in a worse off position than they were, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. So I think that those things do come into account.
All right, Sanet, thank you for your insights. Sanet Madonsela there from the University of the Free State weighing in. We focused mainly on the story of voter turnout as it's emerging to be arguably the biggest story really of this election, just the number of people who just did not turn up to vote for various reasons. And we've been asking you to share those reasons with us through our Twitter and other social media pages. And hopefully we'll bring those to you before we close the show.